Good evening, distinguished colleagues, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. Let me start with a quote. The difficulty lies not in new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones, which, for those of us brought up as most of us have been, have taken root in every corner of our minds. These words were spoken by John Maynard Keynes, distinguished economist, many of you know, and remind us of the challenge of breaking free from entrenched ideas. And there are many of those ideas, entrenched ideas in economics. Albert Hirschman himself, in A Bias for Hope, similarly encourages us to see beyond apparent inevitabilities. Now, while these two thinkers, Keynes and Hirschman, often differed in focus and views, both of them remind us of the importance of challenging established assumptions and embracing human creativity in shaping the future. And this is what we try to do through this initiative of the Management of Social Transformations Program of UNESCO. So thank you for being here tonight, and welcome to the second edition of the Albert Hirschman Lecture. An important function of UNESCO is to be what's called a laboratory of ideas. It reflects UNESCO's commitment, and naturally that of the MOST program, to provide a space where knowledge and innovative thinking can help us better address societal challenges. We strive to strengthen the link between research and policy, helping member states navigate significant social transformations, such as, for instance, climate change, or the demographic transition, or emerging technologies, just to name a few, but focusing on the deep social impact. Now, the Albert Hirschman Lectures embody this mission. More than an academic discussion, we see them, they seek to make us reflect and act more effectively in response to these challenges. Now, the lecture series takes Hirschman's name, recognizing him among the most original thinkers of the 20th century, whose intellectual curiosity transcended disciplines and whose ideas continue to resonate today. He taught us that development is not merely a matter of economic growth, but of trial and error, of voices being heard and choices being made. Hirschman's legacy is one of intellectual, and I would really add, of personal courage. He resisted rigid orthodoxies, preferring instead to embrace complexity, nuance, and the unexpected. He championed pragmatism over dogma, diversity of thought over narrow consensus, and the search of possibilities where others saw none. Equally relevant, he had a profound sense of humanity and justice. This is the spirit we honor through these lectures and through the spirit UNESCO seeks to revive in today's discussions. It's therefore deeply fitting that this year we welcome Professor Jayati Ghosh as a distinguished speaker for the Albert Hirschman Lecture. Professor Ghosh is one of the leading voices in development economics today and has helped shape our understanding of inequality, global finance, labor markets, and the political economy of development. From teaching in India to her current position at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, she has inspired generations of students and challenged conventional economic thinking. Beyond academia, Professor Ghosh has advised the UN, the ILO, the World Health Organization, served in global commissions, and championed equity, inclusion, and sustainable development throughout her research and policy work. Just now we were talking, she's participating, for instance, in at the National Assembly of France tomorrow, a discussion of a very important topic on the Zuckman tax and other things currently being discussed. In many ways, Professor Ghosh exemplifies the very qualities that made Albert Hirschman such a transformative thinker: intellectual fearlessness and innovation. She has been an advocate for rethinking economic paradigms and of the economics discipline as it stands today. In the current climate of concurrent and overlapping challenges, this is particularly urgent. It's with great pride and anticipation, therefore, that we invited her to deliver this year's Albert Hirschman Lecture, and of course we're deeply delighted that she accepted. I would also like to thank the Les Grands Continents who are present here today and who, just like last year's Hirschman Lecture delivered by Daron Acemoglu, will publish an article on today's lecture furthering the scope of this dialogue. I would also like to thank very much the team of the MOST program who have made this event possible today. And last but not the least, I would like to thank, of course, the Hirschman family, some of whom are with us here tonight, for allowing us to distinguish this lecture series with his name. I also thank Mario Pezzini here in the table, who has been instrumental in making the connection with the Hirschman family and in developing the initiative of the Hirschman Lectures. So please join me in welcoming him to the stage now to say a few words before we turn to Jayati Ghosh. Thank you very much.
I don't want to annoy you for many minutes more, but all the scene has been said. I would like simply to explain why we thought that it was important to have Jayati Ghosh here in the framework of the Albert Hirschman Lecture. I think it's extremely timely, and I will try to explain quickly why. It is a pleasure for me also to try to explain why the Grand Continent is playing a role in this event, as it was the case also last year, and I hope also in the year to come. The Grand Continent recently reviewed the thought of Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian thinker, engaged, and killed by the fascism. And was killed by the fascism more or less at the same time that Eugenio Colorni was killed by fascism. Eugenio Colorni was the husband of Ursula Hirschman, the sister of Albert Hirschman. And Hirschman was influenced largely by Eugenio Colorni's view of the world. What was Gramsci in those years thinking? The Grand Continent recalls to us two concepts. The first is the interreign. Gramsci was thinking that in certain historical phases, the old order doesn't work anymore. And the new order is incapable to start. In the middle, in this interreign, monsters can appear. And I think that many of us would recognize that this view sounds particularly familiar today. And here comes the second concept. What can happen in a situation of this tension? Caesarism can appear. Caesarism means that a strong figure, very often a man, take the power and pretend to find a solution, but in the majority of cases, the solution is in reality a regression to the old order with different shapes. Now, I think that even in the case of Caesarism, you will recognize some affinity, including with old Rome. Caesar was followed by Ottavio, that then became himself Augusto, from republic to empire. And then he went on with Nerone, and maybe today it's better to think to Caligula, because at least Nerone liked arts, Caligula liked donkeys, and we are more in this second configuration. Now, what to do in a situation of Caesarism and interreign? Here comes the thinking of Albert Hirschman. Albert Hirschman insisted many times on the fact that facing a sense of dystopia, we need to move towards a bias for hope. And it's not just a generic encouragement to optimism, but was the idea that our society are extremely complex, and you cannot reduce them only to a certain results or trajectory. In reality, there are always different actors and possibilities to intervene, and here the possibilism was showed in many cases. Today, we are confronted with a complex situation, but we can have margin of maneuver and movement. And that's what Jayati has already said in many occasions, and I guess also today will insist on this point. So what needs to be done if we listen to Albert Hirschman? We need to put in place experiments to try and to see if we can move certain part of the monster and rebuild new options and possibilities by means of experiments and learning from each experiment, and then through this monitoring, see if we can reinvent some aspect of our world. Jayati has decided to provide us with input for what concerns the conceptual framework. Hirschman would not have liked the idea of a paradigm, of course, but a conceptual framework, and let's see how we can, from there, move further. These are the reasons why we thought that it was so crucial to have in this moment Albert Hirschman Lecture, and in particular to have Jayati together with Grégoire and Caroline with us, and to discuss. Thank you.
So thank you much. Mario and I will leave the floor for you. Thank you, Jayati.
We leave you alone.
Oh, my goodness. Well, thank you so much. I have to confess, it's very rare that just the introduction is a hard act to follow. But that is the position I'm in right now. I cannot tell you what an extraordinary honor it is for me to be invited to deliver this lecture, and for many reasons, which I think will become clear over time. But, you know, I think many of my generation, we grew up reading the works of Albert Hirschman. And many of them, of course, we learned from, we recognized the insights, but we didn't fully appreciate, at least I certainly didn't fully appreciate his depth, his profundity, and his remarkable ability to recognize the importance of context. And also, I think the term he used is self-subversion, to recognize where he had gone wrong and to say, well, all right, I have to change this approach and do things. I think already Gustavo mentioned his extraordinary personal courage, the huge role he played during the period of Nazism in rescuing many people, often completely unrecorded, and he certainly didn't want anything talked about it. But you know, now when I read him today, and I read a lot of his work before this lecture, just I reread some and found some new work that I hadn't read before, I realized how fresh it is. It's actually so relevant, as Mario has already mentioned, it's so relevant to our current times. And so many of the arguments that he's making can be applied almost directly to the world that we're in today, in terms of how we want to change it and how we want to understand the development process. So it's really, I think, it's not an accident that there is such a recent revival of interest in Hirschman's work, because unlike a lot of the development economists of the mid-1950s and 1960s, his work actually retains a freshness and importance that is really quite unusual. I also am really grateful that UNESCO has invited me, because, you know, I think UNESCO is a hugely undervalued institution globally. It is, it's so important. It's so important to preserve our common heritage, to take it forward, to recognize the importance of cooperating for the advance of scientific knowledge, for the advance of culture in general, and the sense of a common humanity in which we appreciate difference and recognize cultural differences. And yet, like so many other international institutions, it is not just being ignored, but also under attack, really, at the moment. So I think I'm really delighted to be able to participate in something that UNESCO has organized. So thank you for that. But you know, there is another more personal reason why I am really happy to be here today. When I was, well, many decades ago, when I was a child growing up in Delhi in India, I did happen to know Eva Colorni, who was a friend of my parents. And subsequently, I didn't know of her connection to Hirschman at that time, and I don't think I would have even understood it as a child. But very recently, when I was having lunch with Amartya Sen, he was married to Eva Colorni. And so he told me of this connection with Hirschman, and he also told me, he reminisced about the many long conversations he had with Hirschman in different parts of the world, but also, I think, in a family home in Italy, where where he says that Hirschman hugely advanced Sen's own understanding of development and made it much more nuanced than Sen himself would have had at the time. So for all of these reasons, I really feel utterly honored and privileged. And I'm sorry for this long introduction, but it's something that is really a huge honor for me. So because of this massive opportunity that has been provided, and thank you all for coming out in such numbers, it's really delightful to see all of you, I would really like to take up some of the issues that have bothered me over certainly the last decade in particular, but over several decades of thinking about these things. I'm going to think about how our vision of economic development has changed since, development economics became a thing at all. And how do we measure progress? What do we mean by progress? How should we be measuring it? And then finally, the question that Mario asked, well, what do we do now? Where do we go from here in this mess that we're in? So in terms of the evolution of the concept of development, when you think about it, the people whom we think of as the original economists, and frankly, we actually start too late with the usual Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and so on. There were many people who thought about what we today would consider political economy or, the worldly philosophers well before that. But all of them were actually concerned with development. That was their central concern. They were looking at processes, they were looking at how economies evolved, and they were asking big questions about it. Who gains from these processes? How is the product distributed? What happens in that process? All of these were the big questions that they were asking. But what we think of today as development economics is really a post-war phenomenon. Yeah, we're thinking of the kinds of the subject that emerged in the discipline round about after the Second World War, when there were all these newly independent countries that wanted to develop, to advance in terms of material progress and so on. And that was the period when, if you like, it was really about, it was defined in different ways. The most simplistic way was to think of just increasing per capita income. Yeah, the growth of the economy becomes development because it comes with a whole bunch of byproducts. Simon Kuznets and various other people were the ones who really talked about this, that as an economy grows, there will be structural change. There will be a decline in the primary activities, agriculture, fishing, forestry, etc., an increase in the secondary activities, in industry, manufacturing in particular. And then over time, as you reach higher and higher levels of economic growth and per capita income, there will be a shift to services. This was how they conceived that it would be a kind of natural process. And within that, there would also be more formalization of the economy. There would be more women entering the paid workforce. All of these were seen as things that would happen in the process of development. But it became evident that it didn't always happen in the process of development. That, yes, there are countries that show this pattern, Europe for sure, North America, Japan. But, really, these were the minority of countries. And especially as the 20th century proceeded, it became evident that it was really very, very few countries that showed this pattern of structural change. And that for a lot of economies, you didn't get that expansion. You did not get that shift from primary to secondary to tertiary. You didn't get the associated changes that he had suggested would occur in formalization, or necessarily in the share of women in the paid workforce, or any of those. And so it became really a question of looking specifically at that. How do you get structural change? A lot of Hirschman's work can also be seen as part of that tradition, really, that, how do you motivate that shift to higher value-added activities? What are the kinds of pressures? And there were many different approaches. The big push that Albert Hirschman himself was so much against, the idea that you have to have one big organized push that will integrate a balanced pattern of growth. He didn't think that was the way to go. He actually argued that, in fact, unbalanced growth can generate a process of development more organically because it will push through backward and forward linkages, through more demand for certain kinds of inputs, more requirement for certain technological change in different ways, as well as the downstream effects, the forward linkages that will enable more industries to come up simply because a certain industry will provide new things that could be used. And if you interpret even the Industrial Revolution in those terms, the way Hirschman described it, it makes a lot of sense. That's actually how the Industrial Revolution in England occurred, and in Germany, and subsequently in the United States. So it was, in fact, a very telling kind of argument. But, these discussions, and there were many development economists who contributed to this, whether dual economies can work and sustain, all of this kind of thing. These were still very much in the realm of asking the big questions about big processes. But from the 1980s, but really from the 1990s, we get a change in the patterns of development economics rather than development itself, okay? And particularly, it's interesting, you know, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the Washington Consensus was elaborated, talked about in 1989. And it's not an accident that the two happened together. The two happened together because it epitomizes a major transition in the way some economists and policymakers looked at the economy. And I mean, I don't have to tell you about the Washington Consensus. Everybody knows it, so we assume, I'm guessing all of you understand what it is oriented to, but it's broadly speaking the idea that, you know, state intervention is not a great idea. You should really let markets do their thing. They're going to be more efficient. You don't want too much state activity in public provision. You certainly don't want state regulation. And you should allow markets to flourish and deliver what they want. And all kinds of things came with that. But, you know, associated with that, we actually got a change in the way economists looked at development. So because you're letting markets do their thing, then what's the role for policymakers? And so you get a miniaturization of the problems. So we have seen from the 90s onwards a progressive miniaturization, a search for particular tools, and development changed from looking at broad macro processes of structural transformation and so on to poverty alleviation. It got constricted to just reducing poverty. That became the broad activity that development economists and, broadly speaking, the development industry, which emerged out of not just foreign aid, but, you know, the whole thing, looked at. It was all about poverty alleviation. And poverty alleviation then was seen to be the outcome of ways in which you could tinker with both, you know, certain, shall we say, social contexts that presumably generated poverty, but also particular behavioral characteristics or particular institutional problems. So it was really much more micro. It was all about dealing with a specific thing in a specific location. That became the concern of development economists. And it's very interesting because, you know, once you start thinking only about poverty alleviation, it's really just that the poor exist independent of the rich. And the poor exist because, you know, they have issues. They have maybe locational issues or education issues or food issues or health issues, whatever it is. But the poor are, in a sense, you know, they're in that because either they were caught in a certain unfortunate context or they have patterns of behavior that perpetuate their poverty. And so the whole idea increasingly became, well, what can you do to fix those specific things so that then they will stop being poor? As if really, you know, it's a strange binary where you have these poor who have, at one level, they are they're not acted upon so much as that they are actors themselves who are doing things wrong in a way, or they are caught in a particular world where, you know, they need specific inputs that will allow them to flourish, credit maybe, or food maybe, or, you know, some specific thing. And you give them that, and, you know, then you solve that problem, and then they will get up through their own bootstraps, so to speak. This approach is, you know, it abstracts from all of the basic processes of accumulation, you know, the systemic features. So you will never find discussions of class in there, for example. You certainly won't find discussions of broader, you know, social, ethnic categories, limited focus on gender, but more gender in terms of the specific social thing rather than the economic requirement of unpaid labor that generated this thing. So, you know, because it does this and it ignores macroeconomic processes, because you're no longer looking at levels of employment or the patterns and structures that generate employment or don't, and all of those things, you know, you don't then think about absolute access to basic services for everybody. You're thinking about specific access to specific services that would alleviate poverty in that context. It's a very unidimensional notion, as I said, of poor, that in a sense they're being given the dignity of being treated as subjects with independent decision-making power, but their poverty comes from their own particular circumstances and sometimes through flawed judgments about what they should do with their own agency. Yeah? And if you like, the apotheosis of this is evident in what is today described as the gold standard of development economics, the randomized control trials. And so forgive me if I express my unhappiness with the fact that this has become synonymous with what is seen as development economics today. Because you see, there are many problems with randomized control trials as applied in the economic development domain today. There are ethical issues, there are conceptual issues, there are statistical and methodological issues that have been talked about by many people, like Angus Deaton and many, many others. I'm going to talk much more about the conceptual problem. So not only do you get a miniaturization, and you get this obsession with, nudges, but there is this idea that you can take things out of context. Now, one of the things that Hirschman was so good at is actually specifying the importance of context. That you really have to look at what is making that particular thing happen in that particular society, economy, at that moment in time. It could be very different even in the following month, the following year, the following decade. So that's completely abstracted from. And certainly the idea that, you can take some result from a randomized control trial and say that, okay, now we have found that forcing people to pay for water makes them, or no, what was that extraordinary one in Kenya? That if you tell parents that their children won't go to school if you don't pay your water bill, then they start paying the water bill. Actually, was an experiment. So, you can take that and say, well, good, the great thing we should do now is go everywhere where people are not paying their water bills and say, now, you better do this or your kids don't go to school. In other words, there is a real problem in this, not just the miniaturization, but the idea that you can take these individual things and then go there and solve the problem. Now, the funny thing is that in this period of 30 years, when this is what most development economists, thankfully not all, but most development economists were doing, this is actually the period when you had the greatest poverty reduction in history, which happened in China, and which happened entirely through macroeconomic processes. It happened through a state-led investment process with heavily controlled markets. Now, I'm not getting into the politics of it because I think there are many issues with the politics of it. But certainly, if you look purely at what happened to the economy, this was an extremely state-oriented process in which there was a massive push of public investment and very, very high investment rates generated not only by direct public infrastructure investment in particular, but also by state direction of finance, which is another thing that was completely left out of all of the discussion. States cannot, should not interfere with financial markets in the classic Washington consensus view. You should always allow those markets to function. Here is state-directed finance and public investment generating the most dramatic economic transformation, not just in our own lifetimes, but in history, in terms of the rate at which it occurred. Now, as I said, we can have concerns with the political economy of it, but that basic underlying thing is something that is actually true of all of the success stories of the 20th century, whether you're looking at Japan or Korea, South Korea, or some of the other medium successful economies like Malaysia, but certainly it is true of China. And that should have made us think, right? That should have made development economists say, well, if all of these other things that we're doing should be reducing poverty, but they're not, is the answer to go and do another $5 million RCT on what will work in another context? Or should we be actually looking at the macro policies that do deliver poverty reduction? I think what we have to do is to rescue development economics from this miasma, which is created by the whole discourse on poverty alleviation. And so that's the first proposition I want to put there, that we have to bring back the idea of the broader evolutionary institutional macroeconomic processes and stop thinking only about poverty alleviation, recognize that the rich and the poor are two sides of a process that is occurring. Okay, the second concern is really about, okay, when we say what is development, then we have to then have some notion of progress. It could be material, it could be human. Remember, Amartya Sen, for example, was very involved in the idea of human development, which is really about the expansion of capabilities, to the point where he said development is about the freedom to have capabilities, to expand and enlarge your capabilities. How do we then monitor progress? And here I would argue that once again, we have been led astray by what we are measuring, and our obsession, particularly with measuring the gross domestic product, or GDP, as the fundamental indicator of progress. Now, in fact, now everybody knows that it's nonsense, right? That it's a very bad measure of progress. Everybody knows it because it measures a whole bunch of things that should not be included. You know, financial services, which you earlier were entered as a cost, are now a part of GDP. And which is why the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, is the fastest growing sector in many advanced economies, but also in many developing economies today, and contributing hugely to GDP, whereas it doesn't actually contribute necessarily to, shall we say, material welfare, okay? But it's not just that it brings in lots of things that, you know, don't really contribute to material well-being, but it also leaves out many essential things. It leaves out essential care work. Why? Because so much of it is performed in unpaid fashion in homes and communities without generating the, you know, money because it's not paid for. So it's not just economically undervalued, it's socially undervalued. In fact, in most countries, it's not even recognized. You know, in my own country, if you're doing that, you're classified as not in the labor force, because you're just doing unpaid work at home. It doesn't matter that you're working 14 hours a day, but you're not really working because you're not paid for it. But, you know, remember, GDP, it was developed by Kuznets in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War as an instrument to understand the war economy. And we are still using this. Our system of national accounts has done a little few tweaks, but it hasn't really budged from that, which is absolutely extraordinary when you think about it. At most, people will say, well, let's add something, or let's deduct something. You know, so people talk about bringing in natural capital, which I think is a dreadful idea because, you know, nature is not capital. And I will come back to that because it's a very, very important issue. But we do now have, because everyone recognizes this is a really bad measure, we do have many attempts to move beyond GDP. In fact, beyond GDP is now a specific campaign of the United Nations as well, as it well should be. And we've got many alternative measures. You know, in a way, people would say, look, the Sustainable Development Goals were like that, right? But come on, you know, I mean, there are 17 goals, 169 targets, and 231 indicators. So seriously, everybody's going to take all of that? No, that's why governments end up looking at GDP. That's why everyone is still obsessing about 4.9 versus 5.1 rate of growth of GDP. Whereas, I assure you, if anybody went and looked at how those numbers were arrived at, nobody would have any faith in that great rate of growth. I mean, I can tell you from India, where I have looked in some detail, all these numbers that we keep producing, 6.8, 7.1, and everyone takes them seriously, they are mythical. You know, so we're making so many assumptions, presumptions, you know, all kinds of things are going in there to come up with this one number, and then everybody takes it as gospel, as an indicator of the real state of the economy. We've had other attempts. I mean, the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission, which actually was very much here, mentioned, in fact, they made it very clear. They said, what we measure determines what we do. And so it's very important that we measure the correct things. And they also provided a bunch of indicators. Once again, a lot of indicators. Maybe, again, too many. But now there are other attempts. There is, as I said, the Beyond GDP framework of the UN. And I know that there are two people who were involved, in fact, in the Fitoussi Commission from the OECD, who have done excellent work on this, who are part of that effort. And there are some very good economists who are thinking of, you know, the idea is not to generate massive numbers of indicators, but it's to generate a few that will give us an idea about the real state of the economy. So, for example, I was part of a UN board where we had also suggested 5 indicators, but one of them, I think, is a very important indicator that is not really taken seriously and not measured, in fact, in most countries. We called it the labor market indicator, which is what? It's the median wage, that is the middle of the wage distribution, okay? Because the average, the mean wage tends to go up because of some guys are getting a lot of salary. Let's say the bankers at Morgan Stanley or something, right? But the median wage will give you an idea about, the average person, in a sense, multiplied by the employment rate. How many people actually get that paid employment? And that's a useful indicator because it tells you really the state of the labor market. Just to give you an idea, I looked at 2 countries, the United States and India, and over 3 decades. In the United States, per capita income goes up significantly. The labor market indicator is flat. It does not increase at all. Now, that tells you something, right? That can also explain a lot of the monsters that we are seeing today. That there are people who are being told, oh, you're much better off, and they say, no, we aren't. Because that's what they feel. They recognize that for 3 decades, they have not experienced any improvement, and many of them have more fragile employment as well. In my own country, in India, seen as one of the great growth success stories of the world, our per capita income has risen dramatically. Yeah? Again, many problems there because, as I said, the GDP measurements, and they also keep changing. They're very easy to manipulate because it's such a complex enterprise. Governments can fix them to suit themselves. So we have very sharply dramatic growth rates. And since we haven't had a census for 14 years, we don't even know what the population is, but we're guessing. So our per capita income keeps growing crazy, wild, massive increases, okay? We're rivaling China now in increases in per capita income. Our labor market indicator is falling. It's worse. The average worker is worse off. And most people, if you tell them that, they'll say, can't be. But that is the reality. So it's because we're not measuring that everyone thinks India is a success story or that some other country is a success story. So really what we measure matters hugely. The idea is to just take a few indicators like that, kind of like a dashboard, okay? Not a huge number. I mean, it's like driving a car. You don't need only the speedometer. You also need to know whether you have enough fuel in the car, whether your tires are okay, etc. You need some basic indicators. So we need a dashboard that will allow inter-country comparison, but also will capture some of the essential trends that any country needs and the people need to know about. And if we did that, we would probably get a very different politics as well. Because, when you get high per capita GDP, then people think, oh, the economy is doing really well. Maybe I'm just unlucky that I can't get a job and my wages have fallen and, all that. So there isn't that recognition that, there are serious problems with the way the economy is going. Oh my God, I'm talking too much. I shall. But okay, since I'm on a bit of a rant about indicators, let me also mention a few other things that's come from this thing of, the obsession with GDP. There are these concepts that we throw around like that all the time, as if they are written in stone, that they are completely scientific. Productivity is a classic one, right? We're all obsessed with productivity increases. What's productivity? Output per worker. Paid, measured output. So for a country, it's GDP per worker. Now, I already told you GDP, highly problematic. And worker is also problematic because we don't count all the workers, right? We don't count the unpaid workers, without whom societies would not exist. Forget economies. The society would not exist without the unpaid care work that is going on, right? So it's a problematic indicator. But also think about it. The way you measure productivity, today, who are the most productive workers on the planet? Mr. Musk, very high salary he's getting, right? So output per worker, he's out there. The bankers of Wall Street, probably the most productive workers in the world. Who are the least productive workers in the world? All of the unpaid care workers who get zero income for many hours of work, right? Zero minus hopeless productivity. And of course, the paid care workers are similarly very, very underpaid. As we suddenly woke up to during the COVID-19 pandemic, we said, oh my goodness, then getting very low pay actually, which we hadn't bothered to look at before, okay? So the notion of productivity is a deeply problematic one. It's conceptually problematic as well. The other one we throw around a lot, efficiency. So what on earth is efficiency, right? There's a market-determined notion of efficiency, which is, again, I mean, if I could get into the concepts that are underpinning that, you would all go home in disgust. You know, so I will leave it there, but it's a problematic, which we throw around without thinking. Finally, just one that we use a lot for interpersonal comparisons of country comparisons, which is the, you know, when we are comparing across countries' incomes, increasingly the trend in the international organizations, in international negotiations, everything is not to use the market exchange rates, which are the actual exchange rates, the exchange rates everybody faces. But instead, we use the purchasing power parity exchange rates, right? And it is so common that we stop thinking about it. The World Bank gives you poverty estimates in PPP. They give you income estimates in PPP. For many data of the international organizations, you cannot get non-PPP data, right? Per capita income, the World Bank will publish only the PPP estimates. It doesn't give you the actual market exchange. I mean, you know, so here is the problem. Again, once again, there are many methodological, empirical, and conceptual problems with PPP. I could spend an hour telling you about all those problems. But the conceptual problem is also very, very important. Conceptually, how does a country have a higher PPP exchange rate than the market exchange rate? Only when they have very low-paid workers. That's the only way you get that difference. So it's like a double whammy for those workers. You know, you have a low wage, but then you're told, oh, your wage is not that low because you can buy cheap goods and services from other low-paid workers. You can see the circularity of the argument, but more than that, therefore, what it does is that it overstates the incomes of poor countries. And that has a huge role in international negotiations. That actually affects what is seen as climate responsibility, what is seen as other kinds of, you know, requirements and responsibilities and so on. So it's a deeply problematic concept, and yet we're all using it. By the way, it's completely artificial. You will never be able to use a PPP exchange rate. I would love if I could exchange rupees to the euro for 20 instead of 50. That's the difference. But unfortunately, I can't. And so countries have to deal with the existing market exchange rates, but then they are classified into categories and treated as if they are in the world of the PPP exchange rates. Entirely synthetic, imaginary construct that has no bearing on reality. Okay, now just to get on to the next issue then, what do we do about all of this? How do we address? One of the things, obviously, we have to do is to move away again. So that's, in a way, kind of a negative point, that we have to drop a lot of the problematic measures that we have just got used to using. And we use now out of inertia. I don't think it's always political. I don't think it's always an exercise of control and domination. A lot of it is just inertia. But we have to move out of that and actually recognize the world where it is, and then address our issues and common concerns. So, you know, as Mario and Gustavo both mentioned, Albert Hirschman himself, he lived through very tumultuous times. And I think in his own personal life, he experienced a lot of these tumultuous times in a very personal way. And he contributed to making things better as much as he could in a very personal way. But, you know, I think those challenging times, challenging as they were, they are, in a way, I won't say less. I mean, certainly the post-war world was more optimistic than the world we're in today. Yeah? Today we feel confronted with monsters, and we feel that we've exhausted the different avenues that we thought we knew about. You know, the certainties we had when we were younger and so on. Again, that's why I find Hirschman so fresh, because he's arguing against those certainties, both the certainty of optimism and the certainty of pessimism. He's basically saying, no, there are all kinds of things going on, and often change comes in ways that you don't expect, you don't recognize, and that you're not anticipating it, but it will come, and you have to therefore be ready to adjust and be flexible to that change. Having said all that, you know, we have to recognize it is really a perfect storm for the global majority countries, right? They're getting at from every possible side. The countries with whom Hirschman himself would have been concerned, the ones who are today classified as, you know, the developing world or less developed or lower income, middle income, whatever you want to call them, they are facing, of course, the impacts of climate change, which they were not largely responsible for. Many of them are facing massive debt problems. Many of them are facing the impact of very, very dramatic capital flow shifts because of things that they didn't do, not because they have been, you know, fiscally profligate or anything, but because the rich countries have changed their macroeconomic policies. And they are facing domestic instability because of the massively increasing inequality. And they're stuck with a very outdated international economic architecture. It's outdated in so many ways. The trade architecture, well, I would have said it is outdated, except that it's also already over, right? It's been taken, I mean, somebody has taken a sledgehammer to the trade architecture. We are still, some of us, in denial and saying we can go, you know, WTO -1 and so on, but we can't. Yeah? So that trade architecture, which was, in fact, stifling a lot of developing countries, is over. The financial architecture persists, and it is as tight and disgusting and oppressive as ever. So there are countries in deep debt who have already repaid the principal amount several times over, but they're still in deep debt because they had very, very high spreads on their bonds because they're more risky. But, you know, nobody's willing to take the risk, so they are forced to pay at the costs of their citizens. They are facing massive, you know, political demands in return for a slightly higher tariff than the one they faced earlier in the current trade deals that we have seen. They are facing so many different threats of new pandemics potential. We already have seen the reemergence of the Ebola virus and various other things, and we know that newer epidemics, pandemics are very likely to come. We know that climate change is already impacting agricultural productivity. It's already forcing some migration within and between countries. We know that migration itself is becoming much more difficult. And we know that the taxation architecture, which is supposed to at least be neutral, is actually actively preventing countries from being able to tax their own rich elites and multinational corporations at the same rate as everybody else, right? So developing countries are facing this perfect storm. But because of this, also we are operating in a world of dramatically increased inequality. And this inequality is affecting countries, between countries, but it is also, and much more importantly, within countries. And so we get really dramatically increased social tensions. And they don't always express themselves in the way that they did with the Occupy movement, you know, the 99% against the 1%. Increasingly, they don't, because that seems to be futile. So you turn against each other. You get at people who are weaker than you. You go after migrants or people who speak a different language or people of a different religion or people or women or whatever. You pick on each other rather than on the system, because the system seems too large and impossible to deal with. Okay, so that's all the bad news. Is there any good news? You know, I would say there is. And again, this is kind of channeling Hirschman, which I dare to do because I've been reading a lot of the stuff he wrote recently. I would say that, you know, these are, I mean, it's not the cliche that every challenge is an opportunity and so on. It's much more specific. Think of it. What were the myths we were fed as the developing countries? We were told, well, look, export-led growth is the way to go. It's the only way you can expand your economies. Don't even try to focus on the domestic market or the regional market. You have to be based on export-led growth, getting foreign direct investment or borrowing to create those productive structures to cater to the rich countries. That's been blown to smithereens. And yes, we can thank Trump, blame Trump for that, but it's no longer a viable option. And let us not pretend that other rich countries are not following Trump. It's happening. They're quiet about it, they're politer about it, but they're doing the same thing. So that export-led growth model is dead. That's a good thing. That made us treat employment and wages as a cost, not as a potential for our own domestic market expansion. That made us focused on deregulating labor markets, on deregulating our environment, on extracting as much as we could from everything, in that urge to generate exports, because we were told that's the only way we could grow. And yet, out of all the countries who did it, which is, by the way, practically the entire United Nations, maybe a handful succeeded: China, Vietnam. Okay, not a handful. And yet, the rest didn't. I mean, even success stories, Indonesia and so on, they have falling real wages. So let's think back and say, no, that's not necessarily the way to go. Of course you have to export because you want to import, but let's think of other ways to grow, which use our domestic markets or our regional markets, and that means better conditions for people. That means providing more income for people, and so on. So that's the first good news. The second good news might be more controversial, I don't know, in the UN, which is the collapse of foreign aid. Okay, now here, definitely it was a shock, and definitely it has led to horror stories, right? I mean, UN AIDS, the money being cut, WHO, the money being cut, it's obscene and it's shocking, and it is leading to people dying. Yes, absolutely. But the broader issue of ODA, that too was, in fact, a broken model, right? And we have to recognize that. A lot of ODA was deeply geopolitical in its orientation. It went to countries that would be allies. It went with very many conditions, and it often didn't really deliver. I mean, I told you, because it's all focused on this poverty alleviation stuff, and that means different development fashions. First, it was just liberalized markets, then it was microcredit, then it became cash transfer. So countries were buffeted by that. They had to do whatever was the latest fashion, and it didn't deliver in terms of actual poverty alleviation. So maybe it's a good thing that that model is over. Not maybe, it is definitely a good thing that model is over. Why? Because now we can actually start thinking of genuine international cooperation as the way to go. And that means what? That means, for example, at the very least, a model of global public investment, where countries recognize that there are these global public goods that matter for everyone, and global public bads like climate change that are going to hit you independent of your passports and your visas. So countries contribute whatever they can to meet that requirement. And the money is distributed according to those recognized needs for the world as a whole. Now, this sounds utopian in today's world, but it's not actually impossible. And you find now more and more countries actually signing up to specific areas. In the Seville platforms for action, which emerged during the Financing for Development conference in Spain, we had the emergence of many new platforms, which actually were specific areas of global public investment that countries felt, look, we all need to do this together. So whoever is winning, let's join. And I'm hoping, because we all hope humanity steps back from the brink, right? I'm hoping that more and more countries will do that. So in a sense, we should welcome the death of paradigms that were leading us nowhere. So Mario is right. I don't think Hirschman would have loved the term paradigm, but here I'm saying, let's not have that paradigm. Let's junk it. Let's move beyond it. And once we accept that, then we can have an entirely different way of how we treat the economy and what we want to do about it. And that means an even bigger somersault, if you like. It requires us to change the way we look at the economy. Now, what do I mean? Always we are told that we have to do all these things because they're good for economic growth. You have to improve health because a more healthy workforce is more productive, and that's good for economic growth. You have to get more women in the workforce. That will increase your GDP by so many billion. You have to do, et cetera, et cetera. You have to educate people because the more educated workforce will give you higher GDP. Supposing we say it the other way around. No. What do we want for our society? Do we want, let's say, health for all, education for all, access to nutritious food for all, housing for all? Let's say, what are the basics we want in our society? Dignity for all, yes? Access to good quality employment for all. Okay, these are the things we want. What is the economy that will get us there? It is very clear that the economies we have today are not getting us there. So we design our economy to meet our social needs within environmental and planetary boundaries. Now, if you do that, everything changes. It means, for example, you can no longer think of care work or nature as these bottomless pools from which you can simply extract without cost. You have to recognize that there are costs. You have to reduce the reliance on unpaid care work and the extraction from nature, or do it in ways that are sustainable and which reward, let's say, the workers who are doing it, not necessarily only in money terms, but in so many different ways. You have to recognize the importance of universal public services of good quality, public services of good quality, which reduces fragility and so on. You have to recognize the importance of generating resilience, because we know there are going to be shocks. We have messed up this planet so much, there are going to be shocks. So we have to build systems that enable resilience for everyone, not just for the few who can rush off to Mars or can go to New Zealand in their bunkers. And so we really have to change the way we look at the economy, and then we get a whole set of very, very different policies. I could elaborate at length, but I shouldn't go on forever. I just want to put one final note. It's possible to argue that the current global conditions are completely against all these forward-looking strategies. But let's also remember that through history, periods of instability, chaos, disorder have also been periods when global patterns that seemed set in stone have changed. Not everywhere necessarily, but certainly in some countries. I mean, autonomous industrialization from the early 19th century occurs in periods of global instability. And social experiments, the kinds of things that Maria was talking about, these social experiments also have occurred when you don't have the straitjacket of a whole mental epistemological approach, and you don't have the pressure of international institutions that say, no, you cannot do that, not allowed. So there are possibilities opening up. I mean, it's true we can have apocalyptic visions, but they're not necessarily helpful or accurate. And I'm quoting now from Jeremy Edelman, Hirschman's biographer. The point is not to predict a demise. Hirschman was far too seasoned in his struggles against declension to give in to it now. The point is to imagine a different way to argue. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Irakli Kodeli. I'm the Chief of the Management of Social Transformations Program, and it is a great honor for me today to assist Dr. Ghosh in moderating and taking questions from the floor. So the floor is open for questions. Please raise your hand. But not everybody at the same time, please.
I think the greater danger right now is nobody.
Please.
So is it working? Yes. So thank you very much for a great lecture. I was intrigued by what you said about, not so intrigued, but about what you said about unpaid care work. And indeed, there is a deep problem there of exploitation and inequalities and domination and so on. So very problematic social norms behind that. On the other hand, isn't there something good that a lot of social relations remain out of the market? And if we are thinking in terms of evolving toward a better model, if not a paradigm, shouldn't we encourage the development of unpaid or totally free social relations? So how can we navigate this complexity?
If I may quickly, that's Marc Florbet, distinguished professor, member of the International Panel of Social Progress, who works closely with us.
Thank you for the question. We will take a couple of questions and then answer them. And I do have one technical request. When you do turn your microphone on to ask the question, please turn it off for technical reasons. Thank you very much.
Hello, thanks for the lecture. My name is Camilo Gamba, and I work at the International Forum on TOSTI. And the lecture that you have just given has resonated a lot in my mind. I am a bureaucrat. Sorry for that. But we are trying to build something that is going beyond ODA, which is TOSTI, that pretends to measure all the flows that are flowing into developing countries and also to international public goods, something similar to what you mentioned about the GPI initiative. But at the same time, TOSTI was, gave birth based on this discussion about modernizing ODA. So modernizing ODA, of Official Development Assistance. Yeah, sorry for that. My voice is trembling now. So my question is, and sorry for bringing politics again to the table, should people and countries be totally revolutionary and leave aside those initiatives that are not revolutionary, or should we continue working on achieving something based on what is being made in a good way and have kind of a progressive evolution approach? This also in the framework of these tensions that are also rising not only within countries but also between countries. This is something that I see in my day-to-day work. Thanks for listening and the therapy too.
Thank you very much for such an insightful talk. I'm Blanca Menendez. I'm studying international economic policy at Cienspo currently. And I thought it was really interesting what you said about political tensions and interest framing ODA assistance. And in this new economic framework in which you talk about natural limits and climate limits and concerns, we should start implementing. I was also interested in hearing about your opinion on the geopolitical dynamics and how the pressures that we still have, especially from the US, will shape or will play a part in this new economic order that I think it's necessary to build. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Bruno De Conti from the University of Campinas in Brazil. Thanks a lot, Jayati. It's always a great pleasure to listen to you. And then my question is somehow related because you were talking about the possibilities of reshaping the world economy and society, but then you didn't mention the countries that may lead this process. And then we know that, well, the hegemonic power has the possibility of trying to reshape the system to its own interests, the US. This is precisely what they are trying to do. And then the other countries can try to react, but then not alone. But, well, so what role for China, what role for the G20, what role for Europe? Because I feel that Europe is somehow lost as well in this situation. In some senses, it's trying to get closer to the so-called global majority, but in other dimensions, we just saw that they are still somehow subordinated to the US. So in this interstate puzzle, if you can name the countries which may try to go in this optimist direction. Thank you.
Can we do I'll answer these and we do a second round because I may forget some of the questions. Thank you so much. Professor Flaubert, you know, this thing about unpaid care work is absolutely critical, what you're saying. But I would argue that, you know, we can valorize it and recognize that it is outside the market and based on, you know, humanity rather than, and social, you know, basically just a feeling for other people and so on. But that's also very convenient. How come 78% of it globally is done by women? Is it all because women are just more loving, caring, et cetera, or is there a social construct that makes that women's work? If it is, then we have to be creating conditions where it doesn't have to be women who are doing it. Whereas now in many, many countries, it has to be women. It's just the role that you are, you know, you grow up into and you end up doing. And this is, by the way, something that predates capitalism. It's a whole process of ensuring that care work, which is fundamentally essential for society, gets done. In other words, you could argue that the whole gender division of labor had a very important survival role for societies. You know, it's work that has to be done. It's not necessarily always wonderful. So you have to ensure that it gets done. And yes, so in that sense, these patriarchal systems are, capitalism has used them in many, many different ways. Do we then say, well, look, since they are outside capitalism, we can at least protect them in some way? I would put it a little differently because, you know, capitalism is like an octopus. It sort of grabs everything around it and absorbs it inside it. So a lot of feminist economists, what we would argue is that what you really need to do is what we call the 5 Rs. You have to, first of all, recognize unpaid care work. Many societies do not. So you do that through time-use surveys that find out how much people are doing every day. And every country that has done a time-use survey has found women work at least double men in unpaid care work. But they often work longer hours than men, even, you know, when they're both in paid employment and so on. Second, you have to try and reduce the unnecessary unpaid work. In India, still women walk miles to fetch water or to fetch fuel wood. There's no need, right? If that was seen as a huge social cost, then you would bring in systems to ensure piped water, piped fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So reduce whatever you can in terms of the drudgery, the time, et cetera, of unpaid care work, the second R. The third R would be to redistribute the unpaid care work in what is called the care diamond, that is to say the family, yes, of course, but also the public sector in terms of public provision of basic care, in the private sector wherever necessary, and cooperatives, where people get together and share the care work and so on, which can be in or out of the market in that sense. The fourth R is to reward care workers, because, you know, since so much unpaid work is done by women, when women enter the workforce, automatically there's a gender gap. And in fact, it's a very strict relationship. The countries that have higher extent of unpaid work done by women have much higher gender wage gaps as well, because they're not valued when they enter the labor market. And the work they do is unvalued as well. As a result of which, even if a man does that work, male nurses, for example, or male kindergarten teachers are also underpaid. And it's not seen as skilled work, whereas in fact it is actually quite skilled, you know. And finally, to represent the voice of care workers. You know, we think of trade unions as representing workers, but they don't represent unpaid workers. And we need representation of all of the unpaid workers so that their voice, their needs, their conditions, their requirements are recognized also by policies in a way. So I personally would argue that, you know, yes, there is a strong, but, you know, the other big issue with care work, and it relates precisely to what you have said, it's what my colleague Nancy Folbre argues, which is a very strong argument, actually. She says, the problem with unpaid care workers is that you have no bargaining power. Because what is the only power a worker has? It is that of withholding work, right? You can strike. That's the only thing you can do, really. If you care about the people you're caring for, you cannot go on strike. I will not leave my elderly mother on the street, right? I will look after an infant because I care about those whom I care for. Now, that inability to strike means you have no bargaining power, which basically means you can be exploited by society, by governments, by markets, by pretty much everybody. To undo that, we need to emphasize those 5 pillars that I've just mentioned, I would say. Yeah. Camilo, modernizing aid. Yeah. You know, I'm completely with you. First of all, I don't consider myself a revolutionary. I spent too much of the first half of my life waiting for the big socialist revolution, right? And first of all, it never came, but in the countries where it came, it didn't turn out so well. So, you know, we have to be more realistic and recognize that change is gradual, it's zigzag, it goes in different ways. And again, you know, Hirschman, like, it can result in unexpected outcomes, yeah? So, do we leave aside things that can work? Absolutely not. I would say rather the other way, 100 flowers approach, everything. We do everything possible in every which way. I'm delighted you're a bureaucrat because we need good bureaucrats desperately. And so I would say we have to work wherever we are, in whatever form, in whatever small way, as well as large way. There is no either or. And it's not that if you do one, you do not have to do the other, or you can forget about it and say, no, until the big change comes, we're just going to work for overthrow. No, not any of that, yes. Bianca, the geopolitical dynamics, ooh, yeah. Okay, of ODA. So right now, geopolitics is pretty bad, right? We can't get away from that one. It's not in our favor. But out of these periods of complete instability come new alignments, okay? And I'm not saying I can see all of them. Somebody asked which are the countries. Bruno, you asked which are the countries. You know, again, I will channel in Hirschman. He would never make predictions like that because you can't say, right? Because these are political things that change a lot. A government, I mean, there are many governments that I'm very much in favor of and which are being excellent in global geopolitics today. But, you know, tomorrow the government may fall. Tomorrow the government may change in its orientation. Things can happen. Maybe a really disgusting government can suddenly be forced to do something good. So, so taking your question first, of these, which, look, there is no doubt that in geopolitical terms, China is a player we cannot ignore, who's going to become much, much more important and will reshape global power. No question about it. Because of China, other countries, middle powers, whatever you want to call them, are also going to be flexing their muscles in many different ways. Some of them are horrible regimes, sure. Some of them are not democratic. They are not equal within their countries. They are, you know, patriarchal, maybe even fascistic, et cetera, et cetera. The geopolitics will nonetheless change in ways that could end up being more democratizing, whether it's sought for or not. And particularly that would happen, I believe, if international financial institutions become irrelevant, which is more and more likely to happen, because the more they stick to the old pattern, the less relevant they will be, you know? And the more they are controlled completely by the US and by sort of Europe going along with whatever the US says, the less relevant they will be, and other alternatives, currently under the radar, but definitely in formation, will become more significant, I think, in a lot of these things. But what does that mean internally? And so here again, I would say, you know, governments don't do things because they are good. I mean, there are leaders I respect. There are leaders I think are, you know, really determined to do the best things they can and so on. But in general, most governments don't do things because they become good. They do things because they are forced to, by external or internal circumstances. I think it's our job to raise awareness, to force people, to force governments to do good, you know, I mean. And so that can even happen from pretty awful governments. Yeah? All kinds of changes can occur even under right-wing regimes, unexpectedly, because of pressure of different kinds. And that brings me back to Bianca's question about the geopolitical dynamics, which is that I believe that the old ODA pattern is dead. Actually, it's, you know, nobody has announced the death yet. There isn't the obituary and so on, but it is actually dead. Now, that's a good thing because so much of it was completely geostrategic. I mean, I don't know if you all realize, 87% of the aid, no, 90, I mean, I forget the exact number, but it's more than 87% of the aid of US and Europe in 2023 went to Ukraine in different ways, or to refugees funded, you know, Ukrainian refugees that they were funding, and they called that aid, and so on and so forth. So, you know, it was already a dribble. It was already a joke. And so we should not be mourning the passing of that. What we should instead be saying is, okay, what are the options for even groups of countries to do? How do we say, if UNAIDS is being defunded, then the countries that are going to be directly affected by that have to get together and fund it. And it's a tiny amount. It's some 440 million, nothing, right? Even for a bunch of African countries to get together and do it, which I believe is already happening. WHO, if you recognize this is a global public good, you fund it. And we have seen an increase in funding from other countries. Not yet enough to counter the US decline, but it will happen. And I think we're going to see more and more of that, as I said, essentially because I do believe humanity steps back from the brink. You know, and we have done it in the past. We did it after the Second World War. You know, it can happen. Even in very uneven and unequal worlds, you do get finally a sense of survival and, you know, enlightened self-interest, if you like. Yeah, yeah, there was a question.
Thank you very much. I think we're ready for the second round. So if we can see the round of hands. Right there, gentlemen.
Good evening. Just the change of the path. Sorry, it's Monia. And is there any hope coming from the BRICS? Are they going to do the economics in another way, protecting their people? Thank you.
Hello, congratulations on a great talk. My name is Rita da Costa from the OECD. I think you place a little bit of hope in what happened in Sevilla, in these platforms for action. One of those actions was the Beyond GDP Global Alliance that was put together by Spain, UNCTAD, and OECD. So the objective is to move from GDP in international cooperation, in the allocation of international cooperation. So I have a few questions on how would you sort of advise for this alliance, for instance, how this alliance could get traction, knowing that there are different groupings of countries with different interests, LDCs, mix, seeds. How would you see like this alliance moving only from everyone criticizing GDP to actual use of, let's say, the indicators of the UNCTAD high-level group? And also, like you mentioned, this genuine international cooperation, like how could this alliance be a tool for this genuine international cooperation moving forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It's great to hear your lecture this evening. My name is Chris Hagedorn. I teach global food politics at Sciences Po University. And while I'd love to hear your views on SDG 2, ending global hunger and malnutrition, in fact, I'd like you to perhaps prognosticate on what will happen in 4 years' time. We've had the Millennium Development Goals from 2000. We've had the SDGs, many of which are failing badly. In the context of what you see as a changing order with the arisal of monsters as various monsters, how do you see, or how are you advising, because I'm sure many people are asking your opinion, what comes after the SDGs? And is this system going to break, including the UN system itself? How do you see it restructured?
Hello, thank you so much for the amazing talk. I'm Elisabeth Toué and I'm a student at Sciences Po, but also at the university in Vienna, and we talked about your, everything you wrote a lot in Vienna as well. So I'm really happy to hear you and hear how you are conveying the arguments. It's really a privilege. So me personally, but also in my circle of friends, family, etc., we are very worried about declining democracies in Europe, but also globally. And my question would be, like, bottom-up approach. How do you think can we manage to find a new language or a new way of kind of strengthening democracy, strengthening this humanity and empathy that you were also touching upon? I would really be interested in learning more about what you think there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Like everyone said, thank you for such an insightful talk. My name is Sophie Churko. I'm a master's student in development communications at AUP. And my question for you is, given the current environment of chaos and instability, what do you think is the first actionable step in establishing this new framework, and who needs to take that first step? Does it lie with the people? Does it lie with governments, NGOs?
Yes. Another set of really interesting and difficult questions. Monia, well, where is Monia? Yes, there you are, yes. Will the economics of the BRICS be different? At the moment, I don't think so, right? Let's be clear. I mean, there are certainly some countries that are trying to make important initiatives, Brazil, South Africa. In general, China has been doing a lot of interesting things domestically as well. Again, you know, authoritarian states often end up doing better in material terms for their people because you need to keep the pressure lid on. So you can't afford to have, you know, very, very anti-people material policies in a way. So, but will the BRICS in general, or certainly BRICS Plus will not, right? I mean, there are a lot of undemocratic, but also elite-driven regimes, shall we say, in there. Does that mean that they will not, over time, do things differently? I think that is the big question. So I personally believe that not just BRICS, but a lot of other countries have the potential to be very, very different, even in the next decade. Within the next decade, I do believe we're going to see significant changes in economic strategy, maybe not in that much broader way that I was describing, that you reverse how you treat the economy, if you like, as a subsidiary of society and nature rather than the Lord. But in many other ways, simply because there will be such widespread demand that it will happen. I think that's really how I see it happening. I don't see the BRICS in themselves as necessarily changing anything other than geopolitics and some of the financial arrangements. But that already is important because that gives other countries also space. You know, at the moment, so many countries are really weighed down by debt stress and by the stranglehold of the IMF and by this whole notion that you have to be integrated into global capital markets, which I forgot to mention is the other myth that has been blown, that being integrated into global capital markets is good for you. Now, most policymakers recognize that it isn't. And, you know, it's a matter of time before Mr. Trump himself announces capital controls, and then suddenly it'll be okay to do it as well. So I think it's not BRICS per se, but I think it's the period which is going to force changes in policy. And that gives us many more options. And so we have to be ready with those options. We can't sort of say, well, you know, we were waiting for the whole political configuration, because that political configuration often arises from options that capture public imagination. So, yeah, I mean, I think broadly that would be my, my perspective on that. Rita, I'm delighted about that SPA. And I think the point is that there is now so much synergy in the system. There is a UN special group the SG has set up on beyond GDP. There are a bunch of recommendations from various UN commissions, including one that I was involved in, etc. There's a lot of movement on this. If you can come up with a few indicators that these countries say, well, look, we are going to keep producing these indicators, publishing them, then it creates a kind of snowball effect, because other people ask their governments, how come you're not giving us this indicator? And there's a bit of a pressure for them to say, well, you know, maybe we should. So I think this is something where if you can, as your group, say, we agree that we are going to ourselves report these indicators regularly. We will collect the data, report it, assist other countries in collecting this data. It already changes the game. And that game is, you know, some of it can be top-down through the UN, but a lot of it will have to happen organically from countries and people saying, that's information we need to know. Why are we not being given it? You know? So, yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. Chris, SDG 2. it's, you know, people, when it was announced, people thought it was the easiest SDG to meet. Oh, yeah, hunger, no problem. We're already 60% there. It'll all be done, etc. And now it's the one that is completely off track, right? It is, we are regressing. We're getting worse in terms of global hunger and in food insecurity and so on. How do I see it 4 years from now? Again, it critically depends on how countries respond. I was involved in a G20, I mean, in fact, in two of the initiatives that have been set up, but one of them was a food security task force, where we had a presentation. My colleague Isabella Weber from UMass Amherst and I, we were involved in this study, which basically we were looking at methods of price stabilization. And one of the things that we made several proposals, including on a range of, working together for global commodity prices, reducing the financialization that is back in the commodity markets and so on, but also in terms of how groups of countries can respond. And particularly for Africa, we have suggested a regional buffer stock mechanism. We've called it the African Grain Management Facility. And we've recommended that African countries, which include grain exporters and importers, should actually create a regional buffer stock mechanism that would help stabilize prices in Africa. They have been the worst affected by the big price increases. And then the devaluations of their currencies make it even worse domestically, which would reduce dependence on global markets, enable them to also have a virtual mechanism in the commodity market so that you could intervene in certain commodities where you're a big player, like maize, for example. And so it's very interesting in that in the G20 discussion, the G7 was completely against it. And the other countries, the developing countries, were pretty much all for it. For such a mechanism. And many of them have their own mechanisms, right? The India, China, Brazil, they have their own, they're large economies, so they have their own mechanism. But in general, the developing countries in the G20 were very much in favor of this. So I said, I think this is one of those things that would happen anyway. It doesn't need permission, right? It's very interesting that the European Union, I may as well say this since I'm in Europe, the European Union people came out strongly against it, as did France, Germany, Italy, because they said it's against the WTO rules. So I pointed out that the previous month, the EU has released its own stockpiling strategy, which says that they're going to stockpile all essential goods, medicines, raw materials, minerals, food, and they define essential items as any item that any citizen of the European Union may deem necessary. And they're stockpiling all of that. They said, oh, but that's just emergency stockpile. So I said, excuse me, but you're buying the stuff, you're holding on to it, and then you're going to be distributing it. So that's what a buffer stock is. But they still insisted that the developing countries cannot do this because it's against WTO rules. So we have all of those dynamics going on as well. My own feeling is that those arguments against such responses are going to get weaker and weaker, because they're not going to listen anymore. I mean, if it's so blatantly double standard, then why bother wasting your time even arguing about it? Just go ahead and do it, is what I think is more likely to happen. But we have to see whether it happens. So as I said, what will happen to food? It really depends on how countries respond. So, yeah, I'm not sure yet. Elizabeth, how do we find a new language to capture the imagination? And I think it's kind of related to Sophie's question about what are the first actionable steps. And so, there's no one answer to this. It depends entirely on the context, on specific things that actually seem to matter. I mean, look at France. Everything in the papers is about the Zuckman tax, right? Which is great because it has pushed issues like migration and violence or whatever off the table, at least for now. You have to have something that captures public imagination, that is widely seen to be sensible, and where people respond in a way. And if you can find things like that, which actually have a resonance with the public, then it doesn't matter who picks it up, but you then have to have alliances. You can't just simply say, well, I'm an NGO, I will stick to my other NGOs and I will do it that way. Or I'm the government and I will only push it in the corridors of power. or I will be people and I will just do one strike. And you have to have alliances. And these alliances have to be issue-based, which means they don't necessarily always have to be with people whom you would ally with on everything else. You know, I mean, as I say now, increasingly, sometimes you have to hold your nose and hold the hand of the other person. But you have to have the alliances, the coalitions, and it can happen. I think, you know, the defeatism that has affected all of us, because so many of the global initiatives seem to have failed, has made us not see a lot of local, country level, and regional initiatives that are ongoing, that are actually doing things on the ground, often under the radar. So I think we have to be more optimistic. It's not just optimism of the will. I think it's actually optimism of not the intellect, but optimism of the recognition that things are going on, in a way. You know, that there are other things going on that actually will have an impact over the years. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. I think that there's a charge in this room and the energy that could continue these discussions probably until the morning, but we do have to wrap up because we're getting close to the 8th hour. So one of the key takeaways here, I think, has been that economics as a discipline and economists must embrace plurality and humility. And given the richness and the diversity of ideas expressed in this microcosm of this room, I need to be very humble and admit from the get-go that it is practically impossible for me to really synthesize and be comprehensive in synthesizing all the ideas that have been expressed. So I'll just point out to some key ideas that have been voiced here, that we're facing multiple crises, climate breakdown, inequality, fragile economies, and the poor countries and poor people in countries everywhere are bearing the brunt of this, although they have contributed the least to this situation, and that the mainstream economics dominated by abstract models that are divorced from power, history, ecology, have failed us, or have failed to provide the answers, at least. And drawing inspiration from Albert Hirschman, Dr. Ghosh called for economics that is embedded in society and history, economics that is attentive to power dynamics. Politics often came into the discussion, and economics that really allows for alternative ideas on how to develop and how to grow. I believe that you were calling for a radical shift, because up to now, economists have tried to tinker at the sides of the dogma, of orthodoxy, but it hasn't really gotten us to where we want to be. So we really need to divorce ourselves from the old ideas of, and there were many expressed, the PPP, exchange rates, and the efficiency and how we view productivity, per capita income and stuff like that. And you have offered very interesting alternatives like labor market indicators and so forth. We must shed these false certainties about how the markets operate, how deregulation works, and how globalization works in general. In the discussions, very often the concept of the care economy came up, and I believe that understanding the meaning and calculating properly what the care workers contribute to the economy will have to be part of this new emerging, not a paradigm, but understanding of how economics should serve greater social good, and not just understanding the care, but also doing something about it. And I really like the 5 R's: recognize, reduce, redistribute, reward, and represent or improve the representation. So, but I think that it's very important to note that there was not just the critique of the things the way they used to be or are, but we also had some insight about how we can construct a better future. And that had to do with true international collaboration, forming international platforms of collaboration. And there, I think that there was a very strong emphasis there on South-South collaboration, which in the UN, of course, for us is a very important concept, because a lot of policy innovations, social innovations are emerging in the so-called global South. And of course, they're all context specific, but the countries in the South do have a lot to share with each other. Yes, we agreed. I think that it cannot be another universal paradigm, sort of this cookie-cutter approach to applying different things that worked in one place globally. We must use economics to design our social architecture and how we want our societies to be structured. And we need to embrace pluralism in doing so, the 100 flowers approach that is such an evocative concept. So with this, I would like to note that the Albert Hirschman Lectures of UNESCO's MOST program are designed to bring unconventional, innovative ideas into global policy debates. Through our unique intergovernmental platform, that's what the MOST program, Management of Social Transformations, is, an intergovernmental program. And what that means is that we're very close to the member states that we serve, and we as a secretariat work relentlessly to translate these insights into policy relevance, connecting countries directly with this transformative thinking. That's our task. Alongside the Hirschman Lectures, our Thought Leadership series continue this effort. The next session will feature prominent South Korean economist, Mr. Ha-Jung Chang, on the theme of economic pluralism and democracy. That will be on the 17th of October. Please mark your calendars to further broaden the debate on how economics can serve humanity better. With that, I would like to thank all our partners. I would like to thank the family of Albert Hirschman, the Grand Continent, the MOST team that has put this together, and of course the staff that helped us run the show today, and our dear audience that have spent this time with us in this discussion. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.